I never questioned why the Millbrook Public Library in Salem, Oregon, had a section that remained locked behind glass doors until I became the night shift librarian, responsible for organizing collections during after-hours periods. The job seemed ideal for someone who preferred quiet work environments, and had always felt comfortable surrounded by books. But I quickly discovered that some libraries serve patrons who don't require traditional opening hours. The Millbrook Library had been a cornerstone of our community since 1892, housed in a beautiful Victorian building with high ceilings, ornate woodwork, and reading rooms that maintained the scholarly atmosphere of a bygone era. During my interview, the head librarian mentioned that night staff occasionally encountered unusual patron activity, but assured me this referred to homeless individuals seeking shelter rather than anything genuinely concerning. My responsibilities included reshelving books, updating catalog systems, and maintaining the building's security during overnight hours, when the library was officially closed to the public. The pay was excellent for what appeared to be solitary work in a peaceful environment, though I noticed the position had been vacant for 6 months despite the attractive compensation package. The library's layout included standard sections for fiction, non-fiction, reference materials, and children's books, along with a special collections area that housed rare manuscripts and historical documents related to Salem's founding families. However, one section remained consistently locked behind ornate glass doors, with a simple sign reading, "Special Circulation, Staff Access Only." During my first week, I assumed this restricted area contained valuable books requiring climate control or materials that needed supervision for patron access. The glass doors allowed me to see rows of leather-bound volumes and reading tables with antique brass lamps, suggesting this was where the library's most precious collections were stored for preservation purposes. My curiosity about the locked section increased when I noticed that temperature fluctuations seemed concentrated around those glass doors. The rest of the library maintained consistent climate control, but the area near the special collections would become noticeably colder during certain hours of my shift, particularly between 1 a.m. and 4 a.m. I also began observing that the brass lamps inside the locked section would sometimes illuminate on their own, casting warm light across empty reading tables before extinguishing after exactly 1 hour. When I mentioned this to the day shift supervisor, she explained that automatic lighting systems were common in older buildings, and that electrical fluctuations could cause unpredictable activation of vintage fixtures. Her explanation seemed reasonable until I realized the pattern was too consistent to be random electrical problems. The lights activated at precisely 1:15 a.m., 2:30 a.m., and 3:45 a.m., remaining lit for exactly 60 minutes each time. This suggested either a sophisticated timer system or something more supernatural controlling the illumination schedule. My breakthrough came during my third week when I decided to observe the locked section more carefully during the mysterious lighting periods. I positioned myself at a desk with a clear view of the glass doors and waited for the 1:15 a.m. activation, determined to understand what was causing these regular illumination cycles. As the brass lamps flickered to life, I witnessed something that challenged every rational explanation I could construct. The reading tables inside the locked section weren't empty during the lighting periods. Translucent figures sat in the chairs, turning pages of books that appeared solid despite being handled by obviously supernatural entities. The figures wore clothing from various historical periods, suggesting they represented different eras of Salem's past. Some appeared to be wearing formal attire from the early 1900s, while others were dressed in more contemporary clothing from recent decades. What united them was their intense focus on reading materials that seemed to capture their complete attention. I watched for the full hour as these ghostly patrons read silently at their tables, occasionally making notes with spectral pens that left no visible marks on paper only they could see. Their behavior was exactly what you would expect from dedicated library users, except these individuals were clearly deceased and accessing books that existed in some supernatural realm parallel to our physical collection. When the lights extinguished at 2:15 a.m., the figures disappeared along with the illumination, leaving the section apparently empty until the next activation period. I spent the remainder of my shift processing what I had witnessed, trying to develop logical explanations for supernatural library patrons who maintained regular reading schedules despite being dead. The following night, I prepared more carefully for observing the locked section's activities. I brought a notebook to document specific details about the ghostly patrons and positioned myself closer to the glass doors to get a better view of their reading materials. What I discovered was far more complex than simple ghost sightings. During the 1:15 a.m. period, I counted 12 supernatural patrons using the reading tables, each focused on different books that appeared to be organized by subject matter. Some were reading what looked like historical documents, while others examined texts that seemed to glow with their own internal light. The books themselves appeared to be supernatural objects rather than physical volumes from our regular collection. One patron caught my particular attention. An elderly woman in a 1920s dress sat at the central table, reading from a book that seemed to be writing itself as she turned the pages. Text appeared on previously blank sheets, as if the volume was generating content specifically for her supernatural reading experience. Her concentration was absolute, suggesting she was accessing information that required intense study to comprehend. At the table nearest to the glass doors, a middle-aged man in a contemporary business suit read from multiple books simultaneously, cross-referencing information between volumes with the efficiency of someone conducting important research. His supernatural multitasking suggested these deceased patrons retained their intellectual capabilities and could access knowledge that was unavailable to living readers. The most disturbing discovery came when I realized some of the ghostly patrons were looking back at me. The elderly woman at the central table glanced up from her self-writing book and made direct eye contact through the glass doors. Her expression was curious rather than threatening, as if she was interested in why a living person was observing their supernatural reading session. She stood from her table and approached the glass doors, moving with the fluid grace of someone unbound by physical limitations. Her lips moved as if she was speaking, but no sound penetrated the barrier between our worlds. However, her message was clear from the way she gestured toward the locked section and then back at me. She was extending an invitation to join their supernatural reading group. I shook my head and stepped back from the glass doors, indicating I couldn't access their section. The woman's expression became sympathetic, as if she understood the limitations that prevented living people from entering their supernatural library space. She returned to her table and resumed reading, occasionally glancing in my direction with what seemed like genuine concern for my exclusion from their intellectual activities. The realization that these deceased patrons were aware of my presence and actively interested in my well-being created a level of supernatural interaction I hadn't anticipated. These weren't mindless spirits repeating past behaviors. They were intelligent entities who maintained their love of reading and learning even after death, and they seemed genuinely welcoming toward anyone who shared their intellectual interests. During the 2:30 a.m. lighting period, I witnessed different supernatural patrons using the reading tables. This group appeared to be from an earlier historical period, wearing clothing from the late 1800s and early 1900s. They read from books that looked like original manuscripts, handling materials that had probably been lost to physical decay decades ago, but remained accessible in whatever supernatural realm they inhabited. One patron, a young woman in a Victorian-era dress, was reading what appeared to be poetry, her lips moving silently as she worked through verses that seemed to bring her profound emotional satisfaction. Next to her, an elderly gentleman studied what looked like scientific texts, taking notes with a spectral pen that recorded information only he could see. The scene was beautiful in its dedication to learning and intellectual pursuit. These supernatural patrons had maintained their love of knowledge beyond death itself, creating a library section where deceased readers could continue their education without the physical limitations that had ended their living access to books and learning materials. However, my growing fascination with the supernatural reading section took a dangerous turn when I discovered a key hanging behind the circulation desk with a tag labeled Special Collections Access. The key was old and ornate, clearly designed to open the glass doors that separated the living library from its supernatural extension. The temptation to unlock the doors and gain direct access to the deceased patrons' reading materials became overwhelming. I wanted to understand what knowledge they were accessing and whether the supernatural books contained information that was unavailable in our physical collection. My academic curiosity overrode the obvious warnings that living people weren't meant to enter spaces designed for the dead. During the 3:45 a.m. lighting period, I approached the glass doors with the key, intending to unlock the barrier and join the supernatural reading session. The ghostly patrons noticed my approach, and their reactions were immediate and alarming. The elderly woman who had shown interest in my presence earlier stood quickly from her table, shaking her head vigorously and making urgent gestures for me to stay away. Other deceased patrons joined her in warning me against opening the doors. They moved to the glass barrier, pressing their spectral hands against the surface while mouthing words I couldn't hear, but understood to be desperate warnings about the dangers of living people accessing materials meant exclusively for the dead. Their concern was genuine and terrifying. These supernatural entities were trying to protect me from something they understood would be harmful or deadly to someone who wasn't already deceased. The books and knowledge available in their section came with supernatural costs that only dead readers could safely absorb. I hesitated with the key in my hand, torn between curiosity about the forbidden knowledge and growing awareness that the ghostly patrons were trying to save my life by preventing me from entering their supernatural reading space. Their urgent warning suggested that accessing books meant for the dead would have consequences that could kill me or trap me in their spectral existence. The elderly woman pressed both hands against the glass and mouthed a single word repeatedly: "No." Her expression showed genuine fear for my safety, as if she had witnessed what happened to living people who tried to read materials designed for supernatural consumption. The other patrons gathered around her, all focused on convincing me to abandon my plan to unlock their section. Their collective warning was powerful enough to overcome my academic curiosity. I stepped back from the glass doors and returned the key to its location behind the circulation desk, accepting that some knowledge was meant to remain inaccessible to living minds. The relief on the ghostly patrons' faces was visible even through the glass barrier that protected me from supernatural consequences I couldn't fully understand. As the lights extinguished at 4:45 a.m., the deceased patrons faded from view, but not before the elderly woman placed her hand against the glass one final time in what appeared to be a gesture of gratitude. She had successfully protected me from accessing knowledge that would have been fatal to someone still bound by the limitations of living consciousness. My experience with the supernatural reading section continued over the following months. Each night I would observe the deceased patrons during their designated lighting periods, learning to recognize regular readers and noticing patterns in their supernatural study habits. Some appeared every night, while others came only on specific dates that seemed to correspond with anniversaries of their deaths or other personally significant occasions. The library's supernatural services operated with the same dedication to patron satisfaction that characterized our daytime operations. The deceased readers had access to books that contained knowledge unavailable in any physical collection, information that could only be safely processed by minds that had already transcended the limitations of mortal existence. I began researching the history of Salem and the Millbrook Library, trying to identify some of the regular supernatural patrons and understand why they had chosen to spend their afterlife reading in our special collections section. What I discovered was that many had been scholars, teachers, or dedicated readers during their living years, people whose love of learning had been so profound that death couldn't interrupt their pursuit of knowledge. The library had apparently been designed from its founding in 1892 to serve both living and dead patrons, with the special collections section specifically created to provide reading materials for deceased community members who refused to let death end their intellectual development. This supernatural service had been operating for over 130 years, making the Millbrook Library one of the few institutions in the world that maintained active services for patrons from both sides of the grave. My research also revealed why the position of night librarian was difficult to fill and had been vacant for 6 months before my hiring. Previous employees had either been terrified by the supernatural activity or had made the fatal mistake of trying to access the books meant exclusively for dead readers. Those who attempted to unlock the special collections section were found the next morning, apparently dead from natural causes, but with expressions of profound knowledge that suggested they had successfully accessed information no living mind could safely contain. The library administration was aware of the supernatural reading section and its dangerous effects on living people, but they maintained the service as part of their commitment to serving all community members, regardless of their current state of existence. The special collections represented the ultimate in inclusive library services, ensuring that even death couldn't prevent Salem residents from continuing their education and intellectual growth. I learned to coexist peacefully with the supernatural patrons, observing their reading habits while respecting the boundaries that protected my life from knowledge meant only for the dead. The deceased readers seemed to appreciate having a living witness to their continued intellectual activities, often acknowledging my presence with friendly gestures that made our unusual relationship feel almost normal. The most touching aspect of the supernatural reading section was witnessing the pure joy these deceased patrons experienced from accessing books and knowledge. Death had freed them from physical limitations and allowed them to pursue learning with an intensity and focus impossible during their living years. Their faces showed profound satisfaction as they absorbed information that living minds couldn't safely process. One regular patron, A young man in 1960s clothing who had apparently died in his 20s spent every night reading what appeared to be advanced mathematical texts that glowed with supernatural energy. His concentration was absolute, and his satisfaction was visible as he worked through equations and proofs that existed beyond normal academic understanding. Death had allowed him to continue his mathematical education at levels impossible during his abbreviated life. Another frequent reader, an elderly gentleman in formal Victorian attire, studied historical documents that seemed to show events from perspectives unavailable to living historians. He could access first-hand accounts of historical moments written by other deceased individuals, creating a supernatural archive of human experience that provided complete knowledge about past events. The most remarkable supernatural patron was a middle-aged woman in teacher's clothing from the 1950s who read children's books that rewrote themselves as she turned the pages. The stories adapted to provide moral lessons and educational content that addressed contemporary issues facing young people, suggesting she was maintaining her teaching responsibilities even in death by helping to guide living children through supernatural influence on their reading materials. These deceased patrons had found ways to continue their life's work through supernatural access to knowledge and books that allowed them to maintain their professional and personal interests beyond the limitations of mortal existence. The library's special collections section provided them with resources that enabled continued growth and service to their community, even after death. My role as night librarian evolved into serving as a bridge between the living and dead patron communities. I ensured that the supernatural reading section remained undisturbed during daytime hours while protecting living patrons from accidentally accessing materials that could kill them. The responsibility was profound, requiring me to maintain services for two completely different types of library users. The library's administration eventually provided me with additional training about the supernatural collections and their history, acknowledging that the night librarian position required special knowledge about serving deceased patrons safely. I learned protocols for managing supernatural activity while ensuring that living patrons remained unaware of the library's extended services for dead readers. However, my comfortable arrangement with the supernatural reading section was disrupted when the city council proposed budget cuts that would require the library to reduce overnight hours and eliminate night staff positions. The proposal threatened to end the supernatural services that had been operating for over 130 years, potentially leaving deceased patrons without access to the reading materials they required for their continued intellectual development. The supernatural patrons became increasingly agitated as news of the proposed changes spread through whatever communication network existed among Salem's deceased community. More ghostly readers began appearing during the lighting periods, and their behavior became less focused on reading and more concerned with protecting their access to supernatural knowledge. I witnessed supernatural patrons attempting to interact with the physical world in ways I had never seen before. Books in the general collection began rearranging themselves overnight, organizing into patterns that spelled out messages about the importance of maintaining library services for all community members. The temperature fluctuations around the special collections section became more extreme, and electronic systems throughout the building began experiencing unexplained malfunctions. The deceased patrons were using whatever supernatural abilities they possessed to demonstrate their continued need for library services, but their activities were frightening living staff and patrons who didn't understand the reasons for the increased paranormal activity. The library administration found itself caught between budget pressures and supernatural protests that couldn't be easily explained to city officials. I tried to communicate with the ghostly patrons during their lighting periods, explaining the financial difficulties facing the library and attempting to negotiate solutions that would maintain their access while accommodating budget constraints. However, the supernatural readers had spent decades or centuries developing relationships with the library's special collections, and they weren't willing to accept any reduction in services they considered essential for their continued existence. The conflict escalated when several supernatural patrons began appearing during daytime hours, becoming visible to living patrons who weren't prepared for encounters with deceased library users. Children became terrified when ghostly readers attempted to help them select books, and adults fled when transparent figures tried to assist with research questions using knowledge that existed only in supernatural realms. The library was forced to close temporarily while the administration tried to resolve the situation, but the supernatural patrons interpreted this closure as an attack on their rights as community members who deserved equal access to public services regardless of their state of existence. Their protests intensified, with paranormal activity spreading throughout the building and affecting electronic systems, climate control, and security equipment. City officials demanded explanations for the library's unusual problems, but the administration couldn't reveal the truth about their supernatural patron community without appearing to be suffering from collective mental health issues. The situation created an impossible dilemma, where acknowledging the real cause of the problems would be dismissed as delusional, while failing to address the supernatural protests would make the library unusable for living patrons. I found myself serving as an unofficial negotiator between the living administration and the deceased patron community, trying to find compromises that would satisfy both groups' needs while maintaining the library's ability to serve all community members effectively. The responsibility was overwhelming, requiring me to bridge communication gaps between two types of consciousness that operated according to completely different rules. The supernatural patrons eventually made it clear that they would accept reduced hours for their special collections access if the library guaranteed continued service and protection for their reading materials. They were willing to compromise on scheduling, but weren't prepared to lose access to knowledge that had sustained them through decades or centuries of continued existence after death. An agreement was reached that maintained the supernatural reading section while reducing the frequency of lighting periods from 3 times per night to once per night between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m. This compromise allowed the deceased patrons to continue their reading while reducing the library's energy costs and supernatural activity to levels that wouldn't interfere with normal daytime operations. The arrangement has continued successfully for over 2 years, with the supernatural reading section operating on its reduced schedule while maintaining the high level of service that Salem's deceased community has come to expect from their public library. The ghostly patrons adapted to the new hours with the flexibility of people who understand that even supernatural services must accommodate practical limitations. My experience as night librarian at the Millbrook Library has taught me that some institutions serve their community so completely that death cannot interrupt the services they provide. The library's commitment to intellectual freedom and equal access includes patrons who refuse to let mortality end their pursuit of knowledge and learning. The supernatural reading section continues to operate every night from 2 a.m. to 3 a.m., providing deceased patrons with access to books and knowledge that exist beyond the reach of living readers. Their dedication to learning serves as an inspiring example of how intellectual curiosity can transcend the ultimate limitation of human existence. Salem's living residents continue to use the Millbrook Public Library during regular hours, unaware that their community includes deceased neighbors who maintain active library cards and reading habits that have survived death itself. The special collections section remains locked behind glass doors, protecting living patrons from knowledge meant only for minds that have already transcended mortal limitations. The deceased patrons have become protective of their library and the living people who use it, serving as supernatural guardians who ensure the building remains safe and welcoming for all community members. Their presence has created an atmosphere of scholarly dedication that enhances the educational experience for everyone who enters the Millbrook Library, seeking knowledge and learning opportunities. My role as night librarian continues, serving both living and dead patrons with equal dedication to customer service and intellectual freedom. The position has taught me that some responsibilities transcend normal employment boundaries, requiring commitment to serving community members whose needs extend far beyond typical library services. The Millbrook Public Library stands as proof that truly inclusive institutions find ways to serve all their patrons, regardless of physical limitations, economic circumstances, or even death itself. Some libraries are so dedicated to their educational mission that they maintain collections specifically designed for readers who refuse to let mortality interrupt their pursuit of knowledge. If this supernatural encounter at Salem's Millbrook Library left you questioning what other public institutions might be serving both living and deceased patrons, smash that like button and share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever experienced unexplained activity in libraries, schools, or other educational buildings? Your stories could reveal a hidden network of supernatural learning that most people never discover. Hit subscribe and ring the notification bell to join our community of people who understand that some knowledge exists beyond the reach of living minds, and that the most dedicated readers refuse to let death end their pursuit of learning. Share this video with anyone brave enough to consider that their local library might be providing services they never imagined. What would you do if you discovered books in your library that only deceased patrons could safely read? Would you be tempted to access forbidden knowledge? Or would you respect the warnings from supernatural readers trying to protect your life? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if you work in libraries, schools, or other educational institutions, let me know about any unusual after-hours activity you've witnessed. Remember to check out our other supernatural horror stories about places where the boundary between life and death becomes blurred by dedication to serving others. Until next time, keep in mind that some libraries maintain collections for patrons who refuse to let their education end with their last breath.